All right, let's dive right in today. We're going back, way back,
Mm.
to the late Bronze Age.
Mm.
It was really a time of empires.
Mm.
Civilizations were flourishing, trade routes everywhere. We're talking Egyptians,
Yes.
Hittites,
Uh-huh.
Mycenaeans, and Minoans, all exchanging ideas and goods across, well, huge distances.
It really was a world, in a way, interconnected like we are today, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. But then something happened. About 3,200 years ago, give or take,
Mm.
this whole network of civilizations, it just unraveled,
First true.
collapsed, left behind, oh,
Real.
ruins, vanished societies. We call it the Bronze Age collapse. And honestly, it's kind of a historical puzzle, isn't it?
Absolutely. And what's so fascinating is it wasn't some single event that brought these civilizations down. It was a process, a slow burn.
Not slow motion
Yeah,
collapse.
you could think of it as a series of crises all happening, together, this perfect storm that just shattered this world.
To help us sort through all this, we're turning to Eric Klein.
Of course, the expert.
He's an archaeologist, author, wrote, well, kind of the book on this, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed.
Right.
He really brings that world to life, using all this evidence, archaeology, ancient texts, you name it.
Before we get into the why of it all, the collapse, I think it's important to picture just how vibrant the late Bronze Age actually was.
Good point.
I mean, these civilizations, they weren't isolated. They were connected, dependent on each other, really. Resources, trade, even ideas. Imagine getting pottery, beautiful stuff shipped from Mycenaean Greece all the way to Egypt.
Wow, yeah, that's a long way.
Yeah.
So even back then, people were connected over these huge distances, trading, exchanging ideas.
Yeah.
Makes you realize that human nature, it's not all that different now, is it?
You're right. And it's this very interconnectedness that, as Klein argues, became their weakness.
How so?
Well, when one civilization hit a rough patch, the impact, it could spread, like dominoes through the whole network, one after the other.
Okay, so we've got this interconnected world, civilizations thriving on trade, diplomacy. Then, boom, something goes wrong. What was it? What was the trigger?
Well, now that's the mystery, isn't it? And there isn't just one answer. But one explanation people often point to is the arrival of the Sea Peoples.
The Sea Peoples. Every good mystery needs like a mysterious group of invaders, right?
Hmm.
But who were they, really? Ruthless barbarians. Refugees.
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's been puzzling historians forever. We have clues, little bits and pieces from Egyptian stuff, archaeology, but no clear answers.
Right.
Some think they were a mix of different groups, maybe pushed by climate change, who knows? Others say just opportunistic raiders taking advantage when things were weak.
So the Sea Peoples, adding to the chaos. But Caleb Klein, he says they're just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Yeah, he points to a whole bunch of calamities, a perfect storm. We're talking environmental disasters, social upheaval, you name it.
The perfect storm. Got it.
One of the big ones Klein talks about is this huge drought. It lasted centuries. Famine, unrest, the whole 9 yards.
Centuries. Wow. I can't even imagine. Crops failing, rivers drying up, people just desperate. That's got to cause some serious problems.
It's true. And to understand just how bad it was, we need to look at something called palynology.
Palynology. That sounds a little complicated. What is that?
Well, it's basically the study of pollen. Pollen, it can last for ages, buried in the ground, in layers. And by looking at what kind of pollen we find, scientists can figure out, what plants were growing where and when.
So like a time machine for plants.
Yeah, exactly. And when scientists started doing this around the Mediterranean, they found something interesting. This big change in the types of pollen right around the time of the Bronze Age collapse. It means things got a lot drier.
Not just in one place, right?
Nope, it was huge. This massive climate event. Studies from all over the Dead Sea, Lake Tiberias, even Italy, all point to this long, long drought. We're talking from Italy all the way to Iran. That's how big this crisis was.
It's hard to wrap your head around a drought lasting centuries. That's got to have a huge impact.
No doubt about it. And we'll get into just what that impact was right after this.
Okay, so we've got this drought, centuries long. And thanks to, what was it, palynology, we know just how bad it really was. But knowing about a drought and understanding what it did to those people, those civilizations, that's a different thing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's about more than just, the facts and figures. It's about the human story. Think about it. Generations of people living with this constant threat, crops failing, water scarce, famine even. I mean, it impacted everything.
Right, from food to basic stability, society, all of it.
Exactly.
So did they just give up, or did they try to fight back, adapt somehow?
Well, people in the Bronze Age, they weren't just sitting ducks, you know? They had their ways of dealing with tough times, some pretty clever ones, actually.
Oh, look what? Did they change how they farmed? Find new food sources? Or water?
Both, actually. In Egypt, for example, archaeologists have found signs they were really ramping up agricultural production, like trying to make the most of what they had, maybe new irrigation stuff or, crops that could handle the dryness.
That's smart. Thinking ahead, planning.
Mm-hmm.
Did other civilizations do similar things?
Oh, yeah. We see signs all over the place. Like in Greece, they moved to areas with more water, even tried growing different kinds of crops.
They were really trying to make things work.
Mm.
But centuries of drought, that's a long time. At some point, those strategies, they had to reach a limit, right?
Right. And it wasn't just the drought. We can't forget about those earthquakes.
Oh, right. It's easy to forget they were dealing with so much at once.
Yeah.
What about the earthquakes then? Were they like one-offs or was it more of a pattern?
Seems like they were a pretty regular problem back then, hitting all over the Mediterranean, the Near East. We see destruction, ruins in Greece, Anatolia, even Egypt, not isolated at all.
So imagine you're a farmer. The drought's already killing your crops. Then, bam, earthquake. Your house is gone. Everything's chaos.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to even grasp that kind of fear, that instability. And it wasn't just one earthquake either. We're talking multiple big ones over decades.
Wow. So drought, earthquakes, and then on top of it all, the sea people show up. Talk about bad timing.
It really was. And even though we still don't know for sure what their role was, they definitely didn't help things.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to defend your city, with invaders at the gates while you're also dealing with starvation, rebuilding after an earthquake.
It's almost too much to think about. Earlier, we talked about the sea peoples maybe being refugees themselves. Is there anything to back that up, or were they really just conquerors like the story usually goes?
Right. Well, first off, sea peoples, that's our term. It's not what they called themselves. We don't have their side of the story, no diaries or anything.
Right, of course.
What we do have are these Egyptian inscriptions. They describe them as northerners coming from all lands. So a mixed bag for sure.
Makes you wonder if maybe they were running from the same things that were messing everything up for everyone else. Drought, no food, just looking for a better place. That's a different way to look at it, right?
It is. It's more complicated than just good guys and bad guys, invaders and victims.
So we have all these pieces, environmental disasters, social stuff, outside pressures. But how did it all come together, to actually cause the collapse? What was the final straw?
To answer that, we need to look closer at how all this, the drought, the earthquakes, how they actually affected these societies, their farms, their trade, their structures. Did it cause internal conflicts, make things unstable politically?
So shifting the focus a bit from the outside stuff to what was happening within these civilizations, were there already cracks in the system, things that made them more likely to crumble?
That's a key question. And to answer it, we need to really dig into how those Bronze Age societies worked. How were they organized? How did they handle resources, past crises, all of that?
Like, we need to become anthropologists for a bit. Look at their strengths, weaknesses, how they dealt with tough times.
Exactly. We need to go beyond the big stories, the kings and battles, and look at the everyday people. How did they live through this? How did they adapt? What choices did they make that led to, well, the end of their world as they knew it?
Welcome back. We're talking about getting a closer look at those Bronze Age societies, like what made them tick? What were their weak spots?
Yeah, and when you really start to peek under the hood, so to speak, you see some potential issues. A lot of these civilizations, they were very top-down, power in the hands of a few.
Right.
And that kind of setup, it can breed tension, inequality.
Like a pressure cooker, waiting to blow.
That's a good way to put it. And when all those external pressures hit, the drought, the earthquakes, people moving around, well, that simmering tension, it could easily erupt.
If you're a farmer struggling to feed your family, and meanwhile the elites are unaffected, still living the good life, you'd be angry, resentful.
Absolutely. So those crises, they didn't just create problems, they amplified existing ones, made inequality worse. And that leads to, well, unrest, rebellions, maybe even civil wars.
Right. And when you're already trying to deal with threats from outside, fighting within your own civilization, that's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. It's like fighting a war on two fronts. And this brings us back to that interconnectedness we talked about earlier. Remember, all that trade, the diplomacy.
Sure.
Well, in peacetime, it's great. But during a crisis, it can really backfire.
Also.
It creates this domino effect. Disruption in one place can ripple through the entire system. Like, say, a major grain-producing area gets hit by drought. Not only do they suffer, but everyone who depended on that grain is also in trouble, food shortages, unrest. And if those cities were also trading hubs, well, the economy takes a hit too.
Right. Everything's connected. And while that connection is good in many ways, it also makes you more vulnerable.
It does. So we've got these internal issues, inequality, the potential for unrest, the risk of being so interconnected, all happening alongside those big external pressures. It paints a pretty grim picture, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It makes you wonder how those civilizations lasted as long as they did.
It's a complicated story, lots of factors involved, but when you start looking at both the internal and the external stuff, you see how they got pushed to the edge, to a point where they just couldn't handle it anymore.
And collapse. It doesn't always mean total annihilation. It can also mean change, transformation. What happened after things settled down? Did those civilizations just vanish?
That's a great question, and it's a part of history people often don't talk about enough. The period right after the Bronze Age collapse, it was a mixed bag, really. Destruction and rebirth, new ideas popping up.
So not just an ending, but a new beginning, too.
Exactly. Some civilizations, like the Hittites, they vanished completely. Others, they hung on, adapted. Like the Egyptians. Their power was less, sure, but they kept going. Still ruled by pharaohs, kept a lot of their traditions.
It's interesting how, even in the face of so much change, some things managed to survive. What about the other civilizations, though? Did any of them leave a mark? Something that lasted?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Mycenaeans, for example. Their palaces were destroyed, their whole system fell apart, but their culture, some of it survived. Myths, legends passed down through stories, and later on, those stories, they influenced classical Greece.
So even in collapse, there's a line connecting to what comes after. But it wasn't just stories, right? This period also saw new technologies, new ways of running things.
Exactly. The collapse actually led to some pretty amazing innovations. One big one was iron. People knew about it before, but it was rare, hard to work with. After the collapse, though, iron became more common. Better tools, weapons, all because of iron.
So out of crisis, a new technology emerges. It makes you think, maybe sometimes you need things to break down before you can have a breakthrough.
That's a thought-provoking idea. And it wasn't just iron, new writing systems too, like the Phoenician alphabet. Easier to learn, more adaptable. It was like their version of, I don't know, the internet revolution or something. More people could read and write, trade got easier, ideas spread faster.
Amazing how collapse can lead to such big changes. What about the political side of things? Did those old empires, the way they ruled, did that change too?
Oh, definitely. Those big, centralized empires of the Bronze Age, they gave way to smaller kingdoms, city-states, less top-down control. And that opened the door for new ideas about how to govern, new experiments. It was a time of massive change, both good and bad.
So the Bronze Age collapse, it wasn't just an end, it was a transition, a time of destruction leading to new technologies, new social structures, new ways of thinking.
You got it. And that's why it's so relevant to us, even today. It shows us that civilizations, they're not static. They change, adapt, respond to challenges. And while collapse is never a good thing, it can create opportunities for innovation, renewal, even new beginnings.
It reminds us that history isn't just a straight line, it's cycles. Growth, decline, rebirth. The Bronze Age collapse is a cautionary tale, sure, but it's also a story of resilience, of how people can overcome incredible odds.
Absolutely. It shows us that even when facing those seemingly impossible challenges, humans have this incredible ability to adapt, innovate, and come back stronger. And by studying the past, seeing how they did it, maybe we can find clues for how to handle our own challenges today.
Well said. The Bronze Age collapse was a turning point, a time of both destruction and creation. We can learn from the mistakes of those civilizations, but also be inspired by their resilience, their ability to make something new out of the wreckage of the old.
And for anyone listening who wants to learn more about this period, Eric Klein's book, 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, is a great place to start. It really brings that world to life.
Absolutely. And he also wrote a follow-up, After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilizations, which looks at what happened after the collapse, how the pieces were picked up and put back together in a new way. Definitely worth a read.
Well, thanks for joining us on this trip back in time. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning from the past. Because history, it's not just about what happened. It's about understanding ourselves and our place in the grand scheme of things.